Thank you so much, Faith. I am here with Sarah Longwell, longtime Republican strategist, principal at Longwell Partners, a communications firm, Defending Democracy Together, Republican Accountability Project. I have this on the note card, she does so much stuff. Republican Voters Against Trump, Republicans for the Rule of Law, publisher of The Bulwark, a board member of the 19, and my personal favorite, host of the Focus Group podcast. If you don't listen to this podcast, you should. It comes out on Saturdays. As my colleagues, friends, and family can attest, every single week when it comes out, I send it out on text messages and Slack. You have to listen to this podcast. So thank you for joining us, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm struggling with my voice a little bit right now, so I'm going to try to be cool, but I have a live show tonight in front of 600 people at 6 to 9, and I'm going to sound like this, so I'm going to try to warm myself up right now.
Well, thank you. So I would love to talk about some of these focus groups, because the thing I really love about the focus group podcast is I feel like you actually get a more unvarnished version of the truth from voters than even a journalist does, because they're not speaking to a reporter, they're not already defensive, they know that their names won't be used. And because we're here today to talk about democracy, I just wanted to throw out a couple of statistics before we start talking about what you're hearing in the focus groups. Gallup recently, it was a couple months ago, said that only 28% of Americans are very satisfied with the way our democracy is working. Yet, when you look at issues that are important to people when they vote, 36% say something to do with the economy. Within the 74% that's not economy related, only 3% say that voting, democracy, and elections are important to them, or in the top issue going into this election. So, are you hearing anything that helps us kind of reconcile these numbers that less than a third of our country thinks our democracy is working or they're satisfied, yet only 3% of them plan on voting on that issue?
Yeah, democracy is a tricky word. In large part because it's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, right? Like, people don't have a strict definition for what democracy means to them. So for some people it means voting. For a lot of Americans, it's just like that thing we do here. It's not specific. And this happens in the focus groups all the time, where we say like, hey, how do you think things are going in the country? People generally say not good. We ask what matters to them. They say the economy, they say immigration, they say crime. They never bring up democracy. We often introduce democracy and say, we'll just ask them, how do you think democracy is going? Or like, how do you feel about American democracy? And I would say the worst news is that it's hyper polarized the way everything else is, right? So Republicans think that Democrats are a threat to democracy because they stole the last election. Democrats think Republicans are a threat to democracy because they lied about the election being stolen and then attacked the Capitol. And so, that kind of polarization around democracy and people not having sort of a specific idea of what it means, I think is the problem. The good news is that, so we did this thing recently with the focus groups where we talked a lot to the 70% of Republicans who believe that the election was stolen, but we decided to isolate the 30% don't think it was stolen and just talk to them and figure out, what did they think? And one of the things that was interesting is that they had so much more faith in both in America and its systems. And so the more faith people had that things in America just work right, this is what they would say. They would just say, yeah, well, we have checks and balances, and maybe there was a little something wrong, but they recounted and they did it, and look, everything was fine. And so their faith in the country, their faith in our ability to do things correctly, made them more likely to believe that things were okay. And so I have long posited that one of the things we're going to need to do to help people feel better about democracy is to try to help them feel better about America, because the two are interlinked, right? They don't think about democracy's this thing up here, and it's like the air we breathe, it's like the water we swim in for Americans. And so the more faith they have in America, and I don't have to tell you guys, one of the things that's happening, and one of the things that's been sort of striking about Trump, is the cratering of faith in our institutions, the cratering of faith in each other, the lack of trust, the total breakdown in us believing that our systems work right. And Trump feeds into that, right? He wants to tell you that America is a dark place, that we do things bad here. And one of the reasons that, I'm kind of a lapsed Republican at this point, but one of the reasons I was a Republican for so long is I always kind of felt like the left was down on America. That they were always critical, everything we did here was negative. But it really is the Republican Party now that's decided, like the Republicans were much more like, oh, America's a great place, and I bought into that. But the Republican Party has decided that America is just a catastrophe. It's like the American card speech that Trump gave. And that is deeply undermining people's faith in that thing we do here, which is undermining people's faith in democracy.
I'm glad you got kind of into the next steps of how we come back from that. Do you think that's something that candidates should be doing? Is it something the party should be doing? Is it citizens in terms of getting people back to a place where they feel positive about America?
It's all that, look, American leadership, we are in serious, what's the word? Like, the absence. One time I was doing a podcast, I was doing Hacks on Tap, and I used the word diphthora, which I used it very casually, like there's a diphthora of faith in America, and Dave Axelrod was like, I don't think that's a word. And I was like, no, my mom says it, it's definitely a word, I've been using it my entire life. And then I Googled it while I was on the thing, and I was like, this is not a word. And then I told them they had to cut it out, and they didn't, they just let the whole thing play. But I'm always looking for a word that means the absence of. And now you're gonna have to tell me what I was talking about.
I was asking how we get people back to a place where they're feeling better about the country, but I am green-lighting the word diphthora.
I don't know, I invented it at some point, and but it means what I want it to mean, which is there is a diphthora of leadership in this country where, here's the thing, our elected leaders know that the thing that moves people is fear and anger, right? There's only 5 dominant human emotions: fear, love, anger, greed, and sympathy, but fear and anger are the motivating ones. And so elected leaders have decided to just hop us up on fear and anger every election. And once we hit 2014 and we had social media, like, did they micro-target our fear and anger? Like, now we are so hopped up on it that there's not a lot of people out there peddling American greatness or, hey, like, let's try to be more perfect. Hey, we're like doing the best we can. Like, we should try to be a unified country. Like, I don't want to get all hopey changey, like sound like Obama on you, but I do think that it is important to have elected leaders who actually believe in the country and believe in what we're doing here. And I think that one of the only ways we get out of this is to have leaders who are able to articulate both why America is good, why we should have a strong role in the world, and why democracy matters. And I think Biden's been sort of trying to do this. He's a tough messenger. He just sort of doesn't have the stuff to, like, I think, really bring it across for people, but he is trying. And I'm sorry, let me just say one last thing, which is, people always say, like, do voters care about democracy? And the answer broadly is no. They don't. It just doesn't come up. But right now, if you ask somebody who is like a 2-time Trump voter who's not going to vote for them again or vote for Trump again, the reason is January 6th and Trump's lies about the election being stolen. And they tend to be older. They tend to be Republicans who voted for Ronald Reagan and John McCain and Mitt Romney, and they think that what's happening right now is wrong. And so it's weird. It's like, it doesn't matter broadly, except it matters extraordinarily. It matters a lot to the people who are going to be the marginal swing voters in this election.
And 3% in some areas, I mean, that can decide a state.
That is going to decide most of the swing states in this election.
And I'm nodding as she says all that because I hear these voters tell her this every week when I listen to her focus groups. I'd like to go to a specific setting, which is Arizona, because I work with the 19th and I cover politics, and am always, with an eye towards things that disproportionately are affected by gender. Obviously, I've been following anti-abortion policy pretty closely in Arizona and elsewhere. So I learned recently there's a word for kind of this assault.
Is it diphthora?
No, it's not diphthora, unfortunately. But I'm going to start using that too, and I think we can.
I just think we can make it happen, and then I won't have to be embarrassed.
I've seen some of the words I added to the dictionary the past couple of years, and I feel like this is a.
It's the opposite of plethora, right? That's what I thought it was a word. Sorry, please go.
So I learned that there's a word for kind of this assault on reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights. And overseas, they call it the anti-gender movement. And I read this recently, and it's just starting to be used here. And I was like, oh, that's a word for it. But the way they talk about it in other countries, like Poland, for example, they tie it to being an anti-democratic movement. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot in a place like Arizona, where if you literally haven't turned on the news or opened a newspaper, for a brief period, they're going to have an 1864 total abortion ban in place after their Supreme Court ruled on the case. It has been repealed, but it will still, because of their legislative rules and when things take effect, there will still be probably a short period where that full ban is in place. Now, this ban was passed by a pretty creepy sounding guy, more than 150 years ago. It wasn't even a state, it was a territory. You had a recent focus group out of Arizona that was all women, or maybe it was multiple focus groups of all women. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And going into, hearing from you what these women had to say, generally, and of course polling always depends on how questions are asked, especially polling about abortion, but generally 66% of Arizonans disapproved of that Supreme Court ruling allowing that ban to take effect, and only 30% approved. So 82% of Democrats did not approve, 66% of independents, and 49% of Republicans. What did you hear from those women in that focus group?
So I did do a couple groups of Arizona women and swing voters and Trump voters. And here's what's interesting about abortion and Trump voters, which is any Trump voting group, two-time Trump voting group, half the group is pro-choice, right? And not like nominally pro-choice, like pretty pro-choice. And that was the same in these groups. But even people who are pro-life now, and this has been a real switch since Roe was repealed, is people say, well, I'm pro-life, but I believe in a woman's right to choose. And the first time I heard that, I was like, well, you're not. That's not linear. But then I heard it so often, and I realized that really what people are saying is, I personally am pro-life, but I do not like that this was repealed, and I do not like that women no longer have this choice. And in the group of two-time Trump voters, this happens whenever you get a group. I've done a lot of abortion focus groups with just women, and the thing that always happens is the women start to tell stories about themselves and about people that they know. And in this group, there were 3 women who had abortions themselves and one who had a catastrophic health event during her pregnancy. And they all bond very quickly, as you can imagine, sort of women do, and supporting each the first person kind of tentatively said it, and then 2 other women said, I had a similar situation. And I think that that's why abortion is so potent. And one of the things that I think it's tough for people to understand in sort of pundit world and from the polling is, just like I said at the beginning, we always ask at the top of the focus groups, how do you think things are going and what's important to you? People don't say abortion. They don't say reproductive rights. It just doesn't, it's not like a top of mind thing. But when we ask the level of emotion that hits, the way that people respond to it is so intense that I always felt, I don't know why this is my second David Axelrod story, but I was at a thing.
There's no diphthera.
I don't know why. This was a different time. But I was at the University of Chicago doing that with him and 2 other dudes, Trump's pollster and Anzalone, Biden's pollster. And they were all of the opinion that Democrats, this is in 2022, that Democrats were talking about abortion too much going into the 2022 election. And I was like, I don't think so. Because the thing about abortion is it has to be high salience. It is not top of mind for people organically, but if you make it high salience, their emotional reaction to it is extremely high. And so you have to talk about it. You have to make it a dominant issue. And that's the focus groups have really taught me that, because when you watch it, it's not what they say. Out of the gate, they talk about the economy. But if you ask them what they think, people start crying and telling their stories. And so I just think it's very obvious that the only way to make abortion impact the election is to make it high salience. And to make it top of mind for people.
One of the things that struck me as I listened to that episode specifically was the empathy there in that group for one another. And I just kept thinking, why can't we see this on a bigger scale in our politics? And I feel like that's probably not uncommon when you have people in these settings. They were speaking about and to one another in a very respectful, nice way, and even about people they didn't know, saying things like, well, I would never want to judge someone, I'm anti-abortion, but I'm pro-choice. From your focus groups, do you feel better about the state of the electorate or worse?
If you listen to me, you know that I feel this way, which is, people are great. Like, they're not terrible. They mostly take care of their sick parents and like volunteer at the pet shelter and don't want to be jerks to each other. And it's funny. One of the reasons people think things are going so badly in the country is because they think we're hopelessly divided, right? You say, well, why do you think things are going so badly? And they're like, oh, it just feels like a powder keg and everybody hates each other. And they lament it. They don't like it. Now, 10 minutes later, they're like, if those dirty lids would just stop doing X, Y, Z. And so, they are part of the problem. But I have a lot of colleagues who really feel like voters, they're very down on the voters. And there is no doubt that the voters play a real role in creating a market for a lot of the toxic politics that we have. But it is not just the voters. Like, there's this thing I call the Republican triangle of doom, and it's the toxic and symbiotic relationship between the right-wing infotainment media, our elected officials, and the voters. And it becomes self-reinforcing, like the election being stolen. 70% of Republicans didn't think the election was stolen right after the 2020 election. It took right-wing infotainment media going after people and saying this was stolen. It took them parodying Trump, and then it took our elected officials. All of a sudden, you've got Kevin McCarthy going on TV being like, yeah, the election was stolen. And then more voters think that the election was stolen, and before you know it, they reinforce each other. And so that's the toxic thing that's happening on the right, and it's not just the voters. The voters, everybody has light and dark in them, right? I mean, not to sound like a I don't know, woo-woo, yeah, like you guys. But like, everybody's got light and dark, and they all have good impulses and bad impulses, and there's like an old parable about like the fighting between the good impulses and bad impulses. It's called Two Wolves, and it's like, the question is who wins, and the answer is the one you feed, right? And so our elected officials are feeding the worst impulses in people right now. But I think if we were able to shrink the triangle of doom or disrupt it, and we were back to having rhetoric that really did try to, bring out the best in people, like it's there. They're not terrible, they don't want to hate each other.
I will say that there's some woo-woo on the podcast. I feel like you and Tim in particular get a little woo-woo sometimes.
I'm falling apart.
So in that same episode, I'm just going to stick with that because we have limited time, women were making comments, and again, these are women who voted for Trump. They were mentioning this feels like Gilead and The Handmaid's Tale. One of them said this seems, I forget if she used the word totalitarian or authoritarian, but it wasn't positive either way. I don't know what gets left on the cutting room floor when you put these episodes together, but given those comments were comments about essentially speaking to the fact that they have lawmakers and policies that don't represent the electorate in Arizona right now, have you heard any voters making that connection to democracy?
Not really. You have to draw those lines for people. They're not going to connect things back to democracy exactly. But, I'm not going to pretend like you were telling me this. I'm not going to pretend like I knew this in advance. You were just talking about the fact that there's a referendum that they're trying to get on the ballot for open primaries there in Arizona. And I think that is a good opportunity for people who are pushing for democracy reform to connect these things, because the fact that this was an 1864 law, it was before women could vote, it was before it was a state, that is freaking people out. These women, Trump voters, swing voters, didn't know. People were freaked out by this happening. And it's a good opportunity to connect that to the fact that 9% of the electorate in Arizona is the one electing people running in the primary, like Carrie Lake and Blake Masters, and people who have really extreme positions on abortion. Although Carrie Lake has now said it, she's completely walked away from that.
I saw her congratulate Larry Hogan last night. I was wondering how Larry Hogan felt about that.
I'm sure he's sick to his stomach.
And I'm glad you brought up, we only have another minute, but I'm glad you brought up kind of that ballot proposition, because the reason that's so important in a place like Arizona is a third of their electorate is independent. So they're completely shut out of the primary process, and that's why they're ending up with kind of candidates that, don't speak to the general electorate, because people on either, small camp are choosing those nominees. Well, thank you so much. I think we have to leave it there, unfortunately. My colleague is up next, and I will hand it over to her, Mel Landor-Barclay.